Hey there. For this activity, we are going to be filling in the cell membrane foldable. So you should have three pieces to this foldable that you can see here. And you need to go ahead and cut and tape these three pieces together to form the large foldable before we get started. So if you have not done that, please pause this video and assemble your foldable and then click play. So we're going to start over, I guess, on the far left side, talking about phospholipids. So this is number one. So phospholipids are really the main component of the cell membrane. It makes up, like 90% of the cell membrane. A phospholipid is made up of two parts. You have the phosphate, which is the head, and then you have the fatty acids, which are the tails. So phospholipids are a specialized type of lipids, which is one of our macromolecules. So the head of the phospholipid is polar, it is water loving, and the tail is nonpolar or water hating. And this is really important, this kind of dynamic between loving water and hating water, because if we look at the arrangement of the phospholipids, we can see all of the heads are on the outside of the membrane, and then the tails, right, are in between the heads. So we're essentially creating this kind of barrier between, right, the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell, and then in between the heads are those fatty acid tails that hate water. So it creates this boundary, again, between the cell and its environment. So it's really important when it comes to the properties of the cell membrane. So the phospholipids, again, we're going to have two layers of them. So this creates a bilayer. So phospholipid bilayer. So again, we have one layer of phospholipids on the top and then a second layer on the bottom. Well, we were just talking about how the tails are nonpolar, or how they hate water, but then the heads are polar or water loving. This kind of dynamic only allows very small molecules to cross through the cell membrane. So small molecules like oxygen or water. So only small molecules. Larger molecules like glucose, they cannot pass through this membrane. They're stopped at that barrier. Moving over kind of into the middle, we're going to talk about the different types of proteins found within the cell membrane. So lipids, or specifically phospholipids, again, are going to make up about 90% of the cell membrane. The rest of it is going to be your proteins. So there are several different types of proteins that are embedded across the entire cell membrane. One type of protein is known as a channel protein. It's a channel protein because it allows for the movement of molecules across the cell membrane. So, for example, right here is a channel protein. Let me see, it's another right here's another channel protein. I think there's one back over here, but I don't have this on my slide. But channel proteins simply allow for the passive transport of larger molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So they just help facilitate the movement of larger molecules. Because again, we said smaller molecules like oxygen, right, they can just go straight through. But larger things, they can't. So they need the help of a protein. So think of protein channels as doorways or like tunnels that lead, from inside of the cell to the environment. The other type of proteins we have are called peripheral proteins. These are proteins that are only on the surface of the phospholipid bilayer. So here is a peripheral protein, and then here is another one. So the peripheral protein can be inside the cell, right, on that part of the cell membrane, or it can be on the outside of the cell membrane, right, in kind of touching the environment. The role of these proteins is not for cell transport, but is instead to help with cell signaling. So basically, cells need to be able to communicate with one another, and so they have these proteins that allow for them to send and receive messages, communication with the cells around them to maintain homeostasis. So these proteins are only going to be just on one side of the lipid bilayer, whereas remember we said our transport proteins, right, they're going to completely cross the cell membrane, okay? And so those are used for transport. The next part of the cell membrane is cholesterol. So cholesterol is a type of lipid. Specifically, it is a fat. So we can see our cholesterol here and here. So cholesterol kind of lines up with the phospholipids, and the job of the cholesterol is to help maintain the fluidity of the cell membrane, to keep it fluid. Cholesterol keeps the phospholipids from getting too close together, because then if the phospholipids were too close together, then you couldn't have small molecules like oxygen pass through, right? There wouldn't be enough space. So cholesterol just kind of keeps some gaps in between the phospholipids to allow for that passive transport to take place. We then also have molecules known as glycolipids. We don't need to go in super in depth on glycolipids, but essentially they are used for cell recognition. So think of them, right? It says like a name tag or a phone number. So, one cell is trying to communicate with another cell. You need to make sure you have the correct cell you're communicating. You need the correct number to dial. So that's kind of what these glycolipids are. So they are a combination of sugars and fats. And they just, again, help with cell communication because they help cells to recognize each other. And then we have another type of sugar called an oligosaccharide. I probably butchered that, but it's okay. Again, not going to go in huge in depth. It's another type of recognition protein that is used for cell communication. We're not going to get too in depth with these types of sugars because we just really don't care all that much, but they are used for cell communication. And then again, other glycoproteins also allowing for cell communication. And again, glyco, right, sugar. So these are just all sugars that are found along the cell membrane that again are helping the cell to communicate with other cells around it, again, to maintain homeostasis. That is the ultimate goal. So then the last part of the foldable is talking about functions of the different proteins that we have talked about. So starting with number 9, one of the functions of membrane proteins is for transport. So remember we said that transport proteins, they are going to completely cross the cell membrane in order to allow for molecules to either enter the cell or leave the cell. So they can be used in facilitated diffusion, but they can also be used in active transport. So it just depends on whether the molecule is moving with the concentration gradient or moving against the concentration gradient. If we're moving with the concentration gradient, that would be facilitated diffusion. If we're moving against the concentration gradient, that is active transport. Another function of membrane proteins, again, is for recognition, so and attachment. So some of these proteins can be used as anchors so that a cell can kind of hook on to another cell, but then also, again, pump proteins, which are used for active transport, right? We can see here where we are moving substances against their concentration gradients. So we're moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. The next function of the membrane of membrane proteins, excuse me, are for cell signaling. So specifically, these proteins are receptors. Okay? So these receptor proteins, they are the ones that will actually bind to hormones or other cell signaling factors. This is really important because these proteins are essentially what allows the cell to receive any type of communication from the outside environment, from another cell. So these receptor proteins, right, if they bind to some type of hormone, that will trigger a kind of chain of events within the cell that will cause some type of cell process to begin. Maybe it's the synthesis of proteins. Um, Maybe it's the production of insulin. It could be a lot of things. So these receptor proteins are very important when it comes to, again, maintaining homeostasis, but with communication between that cell and surrounding cells. And then the last function of proteins are enzymatic activities. So there are certain proteins embedded within the cell membrane that are enzymes. Enzymes are special proteins that speed up or catalyze biochemical reactions. So, for example, making ATP energy for the cell. ATP is essentially the currency, right? The money of the cell. So you need to spend money in order, to do things. So that's exactly what our cells need to do as well. So there are proteins embedded in the cell membrane that are enzymes. They can speed up chemical reactions to again keep the cell alive, right? Maintain homeostasis. It's quite literally what it all comes back to, is maintaining homeostasis. So that is it for this foldable. So a little bit of a recap of our cell membrane, a little bit of extra information that kind of goes above what we need to know, but it's still very useful when it comes to kind of the whole picture understanding of the cell membrane, all of its different parts, and how it regulates the movement of molecules into and out of the cell. So if you have any questions still, just be sure to let me know.